She thought it would be just another routine flight. A glass of champagne, polite conversation, a window seat in first class. Exactly the way she liked it. Claire Whitman, 61, was no stranger to luxury travel. She had flown the New York to San Francisco route so many times she could recite the in-flight announcements by heart. First class wasn't just her preference, it was her expectation, her normal. So when she boarded Flight 187 at JFK International Airport, her designer heels clicking crisply across the jet bridge, Claire barely glanced at the flight crew. Her designer tote hung snugly from her shoulder, and her rolling carry-on moved like silk beside her. Everything was just as it should be, until it wasn't. She turned into row 2, expecting an empty seat next to hers, or perhaps another frequent flyer she might exchange a polite smile with. But instead, she froze for a split second. A tall black man was already seated in 2B, wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit. He didn't look up. His laptop was open, fingers moving with practiced ease across the keyboard. There was something about him, an air of calm, of focus. He looked completely at home. Claire's lips pressed together. She placed her tote down a little harder than necessary and settled into her seat by the window. Her movements were controlled, deliberate, just enough to make her presence known, just enough to express quiet displeasure. First class in her mind came with certain unspoken standards, and she wasn't sure this man fit them. She adjusted her silk scarf, smoothed her blouse, then side-eyed him as if waiting for him to explain himself. He didn't. Not even a glance. His eyes stayed glued to the screen. The soft tap-tap-tap of his keyboard was the only sound between them. Her purse, perhaps not so accidentally, nudged his armrest. Still nothing. That silence gnawed at her. Claire shifted in her seat, took a deep breath through her nose, then leaned slightly toward him. Her voice was smooth, polished, practiced. "Excuse me," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The man didn't look up. "Yes," he replied simply. No explanation, no apology, not even eye contact. Claire blinked, caught off guard by his calm. She glanced around. Surely someone had noticed this? Maybe the flight crew? She raised her hand slightly, signaling the nearest flight attendant. Rebecca Hale, in her early 30s, approached with a warm smile and a confident step. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Claire gave a small laugh, the kind meant to imply that she wasn't upset, just puzzled. "I think there's been a little mix-up," she said. "I believe this gentleman might be in the wrong seat." Rebecca pulled out the passenger manifest on her tablet, swiped through quickly, and glanced back up with ease. "Actually," she said, her tone still kind but firm, "Mr. Marcus Hill is in his assigned seat. You're in 2A, and he's in 2B. Claire's smile twitched. "That's odd," she said slowly. "I just assumed." Rebecca nodded gently, already sensing where this might be going. "Everything checks out, ma'am." Claire didn't argue, not directly. She turned back toward the window with a tight-lipped smile, muttering something under her breath. Marcus resumed typing, unfazed. But Claire wasn't done. She sat stiffly, eyes darting between the front of the cabin and the man beside her. Her breath was shallow, fingers tapping on her knee. He didn't acknowledge her. He didn't offer reassurances or an explanation. He didn't act nervous. That made her angrier. She was used to a world where people like Marcus apologized, made room, stepped aside, even when they didn't have to. But he wasn't playing along. He wasn't uncomfortable. He wasn't going to give her an inch. She wasn't used to that. Inside, her mind started to spiral. "This isn't right," she told herself. "I've flown this route for years. First class has never felt like this." She glanced at him again. No visible badge, no company logo, no obvious reason for someone like him to be sitting here. In her mind, that made it unacceptable. She pressed the call button. A soft chime sounded overhead. Rebecca returned, still composed. "Yes, ma'am?" Claire's voice dropped just enough to suggest discretion. "I'd like to request a seat change." Rebecca blinked. "Is there something wrong with the seat itself?" Claire hesitated, just a beat too long. "No, it's not the seat. I just don't feel comfortable." Rebecca's smile faltered for the first time. "I'm sorry to hear that. Let me check for availability." Claire leaned back, arms crossed. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't say a word. Rebecca tapped her tablet, fingers moving quickly. "I'm afraid we're at full capacity in first class, ma'am. I can check in economy if you'd like." Claire stiffened. "That's not going to work." Rebecca nodded, her smile returning, this time thinner. "Then I'll ask you to remain in your assigned seat. Please let me know if you need anything else." And with that she walked away. But Claire barely noticed her go. Her ears were ringing. Marcus returned to his typing as if none of it had happened. And that more than anything infuriated her. This wasn't over, not yet. Claire Whitman sat rigidly in her seat, arms folded tightly across her chest, lips pursed like a seal. The polite smile she wore moments ago had vanished, replaced by a stiff mask of frustration. Her mind raced. This wasn't how first class was supposed to feel. She had spent decades earning her place in rooms like this. She contributed to charities, sat on boards, attended galas with people who shared her sensibilities. Quiet luxury, order, decorum. And now she was sitting next to a man who wouldn't even acknowledge her existence, as if she were invisible. Worse yet, he wasn't rattled. Not a flicker of discomfort, no apologies, no second-guessing, just complete poise, like he belonged here. That sense of control slipping from her fingers made Claire's jaw tighten. She wasn't used to being ignored. She certainly wasn't used to being denied. Her finger hovered, then pressed the call button again. The familiar chime rang softly through the cabin. A few heads turned. She didn't care. Seconds later, Rebecca, the same attendant from before, reappeared, her smile still professional but laced with quiet caution. "Yes, ma'am." Claire straightened her spine, keeping her voice low but firm. "I need to speak to someone in charge." Rebecca blinked. "I'm the lead flight attendant on this flight. Is there something I can clarify for you?" Claire lowered her voice even more, tilting her head ever so slightly toward Marcus. "I don't feel safe." Rebecca's posture shifted immediately, not dramatically, just enough. The words, "I don't feel safe," carried weight at 30,000 feet, and Claire knew it. She'd chosen them carefully, deliberately. Across the aisle, a man with a Bluetooth earpiece glanced up from his tablet. A young woman behind Claire angled her phone subtly upward, pretending to scroll while quietly recording. Rebecca looked between Claire and Marcus. "Can you clarify, ma'am? Has he said something threatening?" Claire folded her hands in her lap with a sigh. "I'm not saying that. I just don't feel comfortable, and I think it would be best if someone else took this seat." Marcus paused his typing again. His hands rested on top of the keyboard. He still hadn't said a word. The silence between them was now a tension line stretched to its limit. Rebecca glanced at Marcus, then tapped on her tablet again. "As I said earlier, we're at full capacity in first class. The only open seats are in economy." Claire's eyes narrowed. "Perfect. Then he can take one of them." Gasps weren't audible, but expressions were. A low murmur passed through the cabin. A woman whispered to her husband. Someone else shook their head. The man across the aisle lowered his phone, eyes fixed on Claire. Marcus exhaled once. Calm. Controlled. His fingers drummed the edge of the laptop for a moment, then went still. Rebecca's smile thinned. "Just to clarify, ma'am, you're requesting that I move Mr. Hill to economy, despite him being in his assigned paid seat? Because you feel uncomfortable?" Claire nodded without hesitation. "Yes." Rebecca drew in a slow breath through her nose. "That won't be happening." Claire's eyes flared. Excuse me? Rebecca stood her ground. Mr. Hill has a valid first-class ticket and is seated appropriately. I cannot and will not ask him to move because of your discomfort. Claire's composure cracked. Passengers were now openly watching. Some were whispering, others just stared. The young woman with the phone was still recording. Claire's voice sharpened. I'm simply asking for the same courtesy that would be extended to anyone else. Rebecca remained calm. Ma'am, what you're requesting isn't courtesy. It's discrimination. A hush fell over the cabin. Marcus still hadn't moved. His expression hadn't changed. But there was power in his stillness now, an unshakable dignity that made Claire feel smaller with each second. Rebecca straightened. We're preparing for takeoff. If you're unable to remain seated and follow flight crew instructions, I'll need to ask you to deplane. Claire felt her stomach twist. What? You have two choices, Rebecca said, her voice firmer now. Remain in your seat, quietly, or exit the aircraft. But Mr. Hill is not moving. A few passengers clapped softly. Claire burned. Embarrassment, anger, confusion. She wasn't supposed to be the one getting reprimanded. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could speak, Marcus moved. Calmly, deliberately, he reached into his inside jacket pocket. Claire's breath caught. And then he pulled out a leather case, flipped it open, and held it up. The entire cabin seemed to stop breathing. An FBI badge gleamed under the overhead lights. Claire's mouth went dry. Marcus looked at her, not angry, not smug, just steady. And then, in a voice so calm it chilled the air, he asked, Ma'am, would you like to file an official complaint? The moment the FBI badge came into view, the cabin froze. The gold emblem gleamed under the soft white glow of the overhead lights. Passengers who had been quietly observing now leaned in, phones tilted upward. A businessman 2 rows ahead let out a quiet whistle. The woman across the aisle whispered, "Oh my God," and nudged her husband. Someone in the back said, "Is that real?" though they already knew the answer. Claire Whitman's face drained of color. Marcus Hill didn't flinch. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. His expression was as unreadable as it had been since the moment she sat down. Calm, composed, unshaken. "Ma'am," he said again, his voice low, precise, and professional, "would you like to file an official complaint? I can take your statement right now." Claire opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her lips parted, then closed again. Her throat tightened. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She hadn't expected this man, this stranger she deemed out of place, to be federal law enforcement. She'd expected discomfort, maybe even indignation. What she got was cold, hard reality, and a level of authority she could neither challenge nor dismiss. Her fingers clenched the edge of her seat. I didn't mean," she began, but her voice cracked. Whatever line she was planning to walk, whatever veiled accusation she had rehearsed, was slipping through her fingers like sand. Marcus said nothing. He simply waited. Even Rebecca, the lead flight attendant, stood still, arms crossed, watching with quiet resolve. She wasn't going to help Claire out of this. Not anymore. And that was when Claire truly realized she was alone. Everyone on the plane had seen it. Every microaggression, every attempt to manipulate, every escalation, and now everyone had witnessed the moment the power dynamic reversed. She could feel it, the shift. Eyes, cameras, judgment. Not aimed at Marcus. Aimed at her. She shook her head, barely perceptible. "No," she whispered. "No complaint." Marcus held her gaze for another breathless moment, then gave a single nod and calmly returned his badge to his jacket pocket. He reopened his laptop. The soft clicking of keys resumed, as if the last 10 minutes had never happened. But for Claire, everything had changed. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Her face burned. She tried to sit still, to compose herself, but every move felt robotic, forced. The weight of humiliation sat heavy on her chest. Across the aisle, the businessman with the blue tooth slowly leaned toward his wife and muttered, "That's what you call instant karma." The young woman a few rows back, still recording. Claire knew it. She could feel the lens like a spotlight. A storm was brewing, and she could already hear the thunder. She turned slightly, trying not to look obvious, and stole a glance at the woman's phone screen. A red circle blinked, still live. Her mouth went dry. This wasn't just a scene. It was content, and it was going to live on the internet forever. Rebecca stepped forward again. Her voice wasn't angry, but it was sharp, clear, and unshakable. "Ma'am," she said, "I need to confirm that you're able to remain on this flight without further disruption." Claire blinked. She wanted to argue, to insist that she'd done nothing wrong, that she had only voiced a concern, that she had every right to feel uncomfortable. But none of those excuses would hold. Not anymore. She swallowed hard. "Yes," she said, voice flat. "I'm fine." Rebecca gave her a long look, then nodded once and walked away. Claire could feel the silence around her, dense and suffocating. No one was speaking to her. No one was offering understanding. The rules she was used to playing by no longer applied here. And Marcus, he didn't spare her a second glance. He had already moved on. Claire sat there, stiff and small, trying to look out the window as if the world beyond it could shield her from what she knew was coming. Because now it was no longer a confrontation on a plane. It was a story. And stories like this didn't disappear quietly. They exploded. And the worst part? It hadn't even gone airborne yet. The plane hadn't even left the ground. And yet, for Claire Whitman, it already felt like her world was spiraling out of control. The moment Marcus closed his badge and returned to his laptop, it was like a curtain fell, conversation shifted, phones buzzed, screens lit up. She could feel it. The air had changed. The hum of judgment vibrated around her. Not loud, but heavy. The woman 2 rows back was still holding her phone at an angle, still recording, or maybe she was already uploading. Claire didn't know. She didn't want to know. Except she did. Her pulse pounded as she pulled her own phone from her handbag. Fingers shaking, she swiped up and opened her text messages. 3 notifications. Then 6. Then 12. Friends, acquaintances, names she hadn't seen in years. And all of them said some version of the same thing. "Claire, is this you? Just saw a video on Twitter. Tell me this isn't real." "OMG, what did you do?" Her chest tightened. She opened her browser, tapped Twitter, and there it was. A video with the caption, "Racist woman tries to have black man removed from first class. He's FBI." Her face, clear, her voice captured. Every word she'd said, every glance, every accusation out there for the world to dissect. 30 seconds later, it had 22,000 views. She refreshed. Now 38,000. She stared at the screen in horror. This couldn't be happening. She was a Whitman, for God's sake, a former board member for the city's Arts Council, a public figure in small, high society circles. This wasn't just embarrassing, it was catastrophic. Her hands trembled as she exited the app and opened her email. 3 new messages. The first, "Claire, we need to talk, urgently. Marcia Kaplan, chair of the Women's Cultural Trust." The second, "Please be aware your name is trending. I recommend a statement. Jason, PR consultant." And the third, the one that hit hardest, "We'll be removing your profile from the foundation's site for now. Let's talk next week. James Rollins, Marston Foundation." Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. Her life, the one she had curated carefully over decades, was unraveling minute by minute. She looked up. Marcus still sat beside her, typing calmly, unbothered, composed. He hadn't said a word to her since that moment. He didn't need to. He'd already made his point. The man she'd tried to have removed had not only stayed, but had exposed her for exactly what she had become, a woman blinded by assumption and entitlement, crushed beneath the weight of her own choices. The irony stung. She'd tried to make him small, and now she was the one shrinking. The plane began to taxi. A chime rang out. The seatbelt sign dinged above her. Claire clenched the arms of her seat. She felt like she couldn't breathe. Across the aisle, a businessman smirked. A teenage boy behind him whispered, "Dude, she's still trending." Another passenger chuckled quietly. The sound sliced into her. It was happening too fast. There had to be a way to fix this. Maybe if she posted an apology. Maybe if she explained herself. Said she was tired, misunderstood, emotional, stressed. But the moment she thought it, she knew it wouldn't work. The world had already made up its mind. And worst of all, she gave it the ammunition. Rebecca, the lead flight attendant, walked by slowly. No eye contact, no warmth, just duty. And even that small absence of kindness felt like a dagger. Claire opened her camera and looked at herself. Her reflection was hollow. Eyes wide, jaw clenched, mascara smudged from unblinking eyes, and a rising panic that sat heavy in her chest. She looked nothing like the poised, polished woman who had boarded this flight 30 minutes ago. She looked like a cautionary tale. Her phone vibrated again. This time it was her sister. She declined the call. She couldn't handle the conversation. Not yet. The plane began its ascent. Claire stared at the clouds outside the window, hoping that somewhere beyond them was a world where this hadn't happened, where a careless phrase hadn't destroyed everything she built. But deep down, she knew. There was no going back. And the plane wasn't the only thing going viral. The moment the wheels touched down at San Francisco International Airport, Claire Whitman was already unbuckled, body tense, pulse hammering. She needed to get off that plane. Fast. She couldn't take the whispers, the stares, the phantom weight of every phone pointed in her direction. The 6-hour flight had felt like 60. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. She just sat there, rigid, burning, while the rest of the world watched her reputation collapse in real time. The second the cabin door clicked open, she stood, grabbed her bag, and moved. No eye contact, no goodbyes. Just a blur of designer heels against the jet bridge floor, her breath short and chest tight. But when she reached baggage claim, she stopped cold. There they were. Reporters, cameras, boom mics. Not a crowd, not yet, but enough. A woman with a microphone read from her phone. The viral video now has over 2 million views, sparking outrage across social media platforms. Claire's stomach dropped. 2 million. She turned quickly, sunglasses shaking as she fumbled to slide them on. Her heart pounded. She couldn't be seen like this, not without control, not without a plan. But it was too late. A reporter spotted her. "Excuse me, Ms. Whitman, Claire Whitman?" The woman's voice shot like a dart. "Would you like to respond to the allegations?" Claire bolted. She weaved between travelers, ignoring the questions, the flashes, the phones raised in her direction. She burst through the airport exit and flagged down the first cab she saw. "Drive," she gasped. "Now." The driver raised an eyebrow but pulled away without asking questions. Claire sank into the seat, hands pressed to her forehead. The chaos outside the window faded, but the storm inside her head only grew louder. Her phone buzzed again. More messages, missed calls, emails, mentions. She closed her eyes. Then one call came in that made her blood run cold. James Rollins, chairman of the Whitmore Foundation, a high-profile nonprofit she had proudly served for 12 years. She answered with trembling fingers. "James, we're gonna need your resignation, Claire." His tone was cold, final, no room for negotiation. She swallowed hard. "This is being taken out of context. I didn't—" "We've reviewed the footage," he cut in. "There is no acceptable context. We'll release a public statement by morning. Please, do the right thing." The line went dead. Claire stared at the phone like it had betrayed her. It was over. Not just the job, everything. The invitations, the galas, the boards, the subtle power she had accumulated in whispers and charity dinners. Gone. Because of one moment, one decision, one man she thought she could humiliate into silence. But Marcus Hill hadn't played her game. He'd stayed calm, collected, professional. And he let the truth speak louder than anything she could have imagined. She slumped further into the seat, watching the city blur past the car window. Her reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, wrinkled, hollow, cornered. Across the city, on the other side of this catastrophe, Marcus Hill had already moved on. He had landed, grabbed his bag, and likely gone straight into a briefing or meeting. For him, this was just another Tuesday, another instance where he had to hold the line with grace while someone else tried to knock him down. And he hadn't flinched. Claire, on the other hand, had shattered. By the time the cab pulled up in front of her condo, the video had crossed 3.1 million views. Her phone vibrated again. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She already knew what was coming next. In the end, Claire Whitman didn't just lose a seat or her reputation. She lost the illusion that she could act on prejudice and walk away untouched. This story wasn't just about an uncomfortable flight. It was about accountability, about what happens when someone's quiet bias collides with someone else's quiet strength. Marcus Hill never raised his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't retaliate. He simply stood his ground with composure, professionalism, and truth. His badge wasn't about status. It was a reminder that character always speaks louder than credentials. And Claire, her downfall didn't come from a single action. It built moment by moment through glances, assumptions, and a refusal to reflect. Because in today's world, what you say when you think no one is watching might be exactly what the world ends up seeing. So what's the lesson here? Treat people with respect, not just when it's easy. Don't judge someone by their appearance or background. And remember, in a connected world, justice travels faster than silence. If you found this story meaningful, comment 1 below. If you didn't enjoy the video or want to see something better next time, comment 0. I read every response and always look to improve. Thank you for watching. And remember, true strength doesn't come from power or position. It comes from how you treat the people sitting right beside you.